Without further ado, I would like to welcome Mr. Sanjay Swamy on the podcast. Thank you so much, Sanjay, for joining me. It's such a pleasure to host you.
Thanks, Raj. Great to be on the show.
Glad to hear that,
And
Sanjay.
and and I should start by saying congratulations on taking up this podcast. And it's great to see some of the early episodes, and glad to be part of it. I'm looking forward to talking on the show.
Absolutely. That's really kind of you, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here. To begin with, your experience through the years from the Valley originally and to the Indian ecosystem has been absolutely stellar. And it'll be wonderful to understand from you as to what your observations from being in the Silicon Valley to India has been and how you've seen the ecosystem evolve over the years. Because if you can talk our audience through those years of experience, that'd be wonderful to understand. And what lies in store for everybody who's listening, and what's the next 10 years looking like for India?
Got it. Yeah, I'm going to be a bit elaborate because even a crisp answer at my age, if I recount the years, it's going to be a relatively long answer. But I had the good fortune of actually growing up right here in Bangalore. During the early days, I'm a native of Bangalore, so I'm kind of one of the minority in Bangalore these days. And grew up here, did my undergrad here, went to France for a couple of years, did a master's, and then went to US, did a second master's in Seattle. I'm talking, late 80s, early 90s. And the only thing that was there in Seattle was Boeing and Microsoft, right, at the time. And then, moved and worked in Silicon Valley from 92 till 2003. A large part of that was actually coincidentally at the startup started by Mr. Naren Gupta, or Dr. Naren Gupta, who is the founder of Nexus Venture Partners. Had the privilege of working very closely with him, learned a lot of what I did over the years at his company, which was a company called Integrated Systems in the embedded space. I spent 7 years there, first job out of college after my second master's, and then a couple of years at Xerox PARC, the mecca of all the innovation in the early years. And then eventually a couple of years at Portal Software, which was in the telecom billing space, now a part of Oracle. I've gone through all kinds of ups and downs, and then moved back to India and lived through my startup life here. Um, lot of ups and downs, a lot of stories that I've actually just a plug for my book that I wrote with T.N. Hari recently, which is also just being released as we speak, called Sailing Through a Storm, which is also a year appropriate in a year where all of us are experiencing sort of a different a unique kind of storm. So I'll come to my India sort of second stint back here in a second. But broadly, I think what I really was lucky to experience was the internet sort of twice, right? Once in the first wave that happened in the West, in Silicon Valley, living in Silicon Valley there, right down the road from the Netscapes of the world. And then that whole generation of things and the really exciting startup spirit that was there in Silicon Valley at the time. And then sort of seeing the whole thing again a second time here in India with the mobile being the device of choice and a new wave that's happening at probably a much more breathtaking pace than it did in the beginning, because the first time around people really were figuring out what might be possible. Now people understand the possibilities and are pushing the frontiers. And of course, we have the whole AI generation that's happening right now, right? All along, I think I was fortunate right from my first job to be in a customer facing role. So my education, by the way, I have two masters in avionics and flight control systems, right? And one might argue that I have almost never used that knowledge in my professional career. But in all things I did, I was very close to customers at all times, right? So my first role, I spent years in sales, marketing, training, customer support. I started off actually in customer support and then to training. And I think when you're in those roles, you really draw a lot of empathy for, the user, right? It's very fancy for engineers to take what they might see or what we might see as an engineer, as challenging problems and try to solve them. But what really adds value to the end customer might be this very simple feature that you might not think, you might look at it and say, what's the big deal? It's so easy to do, but the customer says that's what I really need, right? So throughout the years, I think the desire to really understand what is value to the customer, right? And realizing that value and complexity are completely different things, right? The simplest of things might have a lot more value, and that's what the customer is paying for. He's not paying for the sophistication of what you've built. He's paid for something that solved his or her problem. Is something that was a lesson I took to heart. I can't say that I've practiced it every time, but that is something that I think every time I have practiced it, it has helped, and every time I've made a mistake in any decision I make, it has probably stemmed from not having paid attention to that particular point, right? And over the years, I had the opportunity to live and work in Silicon Valley, but also traveled around the world from, customers in India, in Japan, in Western Europe, in Israel, so all over, and going and meeting them, you get to understand cultural differences, how they define, how people approach solving problems and the solutions and so on. So I think I strongly advise everybody these days, pick up the phone and call customers. It doesn't matter if you're an engineer, right? And during years later on at ZipDial, for a short period of time, we actually made every engineer do sales. Right, every morning you spend 1 hour on the phone calling customers and trying to sell the product, right? And you would realize, very quickly how humbling an experience it is, because the customer has no clue what you're selling, and you don't know how to explain it to the customer, right? And it's very important for engineers to understand that. So anyway, net, spent a lot of time in the Valley, about 11 years. I moved back to India in 2003. And really the trigger for moving back was I had come here on vacation, and so I went through a tough time in Silicon Valley. Actually, rode the whole .com era with very successful professionally. But at some point, I got laid off, right? And my team got fired, though we were actually a profitable business unit in the company, because company felt this is not something that we wanted to focus on. And in 2002 to 2003, I said, well, it's time to take a break, come back and spend a few months in India and see what's going on here. And that was the time when Reliance was launching the telecom service. The phone call at the price of a postage stamp was the marketing line from the Shri Dhirubhai Ambani himself. And I noticed, when I asked an auto rickshaw driver, and I vividly recall exactly where I was when I asked him, time kya hua? And he pulled out the cell phone and read the time out to me, right? And to me, that was an aha moment where I said, wow, he has got a connected terminal in his hand, right? And I immediately started fathoming possibilities of peer-to-peer mobile payments. I came back and I told my wife, we're just moving back to India, right? So went back, packed up our bags, moved back to India. And literally, as I was driving to the airport in the Bay Area, I got a call from a friend who said, oh, one of my friends has a team in India. He wants to see if you want to run his India operations for some time. And so during the course of that, literally 48 hours of transitioning from the US to India, I landed myself a job which I thought I was not going to take. So I landed on a Friday evening in Bangalore, and Monday morning I started working at a company called M-Portal. And then, helped them sort of transition that. But it was a company that was doing mobile stuff. They did the infrastructure platform for the same Reliance data services, built a lot of mobile apps for them, etc. And then said, okay, I like this space a lot. I ran India Ops for another Silicon Valley startup called Acharya, which we built from scratch. Was a very successful one. In fact, a lot of startups have emerged from the first 40 employees of that company. And then I got invited to run Cheque, which was the first attempt at mobile payments, 2006 to 2010. Was probably one of the most breathtaking experiences one could have. I can still think of features that startups are introducing that we had. Cheque was like the ultimate lab, right? We tried everything, including QR code payments, you name it. in 2006 to 2010, long before any of this happened. We had an application that ran on the SIM card on all Airtel and Docomo SIMs. Apple Pay is literally, I would argue, a clone of what we built at MCheck. It was tokenization of cards and running the payment system. But also, we were trying to do too much in a small startup at a time when the ecosystem wasn't yet ready for it. And so while we started building up distribution really well, the regulatory side required, paper forms, etc., to be filled out to open a bank account. And it was just way too early. Apart from I'm certain that as a founder, or as an entrepreneur, I made a lot of mistakes. But there were also, I think, timing was a big lesson I learned there, right? That you just have to be at the right place at the right time. And what's a good idea today might not have been a good idea a year ago, and might not be a good idea a year from now, right? So that timing window for startups is very important. Then went on and joined Nandan on the Aadhar program as a full-time volunteer. It was a great opportunity. 2010, India was doing something really breathtaking. Happy to speak about that also in more detail, because it has completely transformed so much of the course of everything we are all doing in life here in India. And after 2 years there, started Prime, and it's been a 7-year journey now for us and counting. We are an early stage venture capital firm focused on tech startups, first institutional check in most of them. And it's just been an amazing journey. One thing that has stood out throughout this is ultimately you have to learn to serve whoever is your customer set that you pick, right? And whether I've been an entrepreneur myself or an employee at a startup, whether I've been an entrepreneur myself, or whether I've been an investor now, I still see myself as an entrepreneur, right? And that's people ask me, what do you do? I say I'm an entrepreneur. And what does your startup do? I said my startup is in the business of investing in startups, but it's a startup in its own right, and that's how we approach it. And it's a fun time and to be to be an early stage entrepreneur / investor in India, because everything is up for grabs. Everything is an opportunity. Of course, there will be messiness. There will be challenges that we need to overcome. Otherwise, it would have been easy for a large company to do, right? And that's where the fun in this whole thing, the uncertainty is what makes it super exciting. Anyway, sorry for the long introduction, but that also is just 3% of the story.
Right. No, that was wonderful to hear, and goes to show that, just the varied experiences you've had, which cover so many domains, plus the expertise that you've been able to gather, is really inspiring to say the least. And it reflects from the kind of stability and from the kind of answer that you gave. So thank you, Sanjay, for walking us through that episode. But one thing that, I want to understand further from you, that we saw this wave of companies coming from the United States, from the Silicon Valley in 1990s, that have now gone on to shape the world, right, and are now dominating at the global scale. And now we're currently also seeing that conviction in the Indian ecosystem, that the companies that were started in let's say 2010s and early days will now go on to dominate at the global scale. So can you walk us through what is your observation of the Indian ecosystem? Where do you see it growing further? What are some of the industries that I wouldn't say hot industries, and I don't want to get into that tribe of making this a generic answer, but would love to understand your observations of the ecosystem, and where do you think India is headed towards?
Yeah. So the short answer is, we're at the start. We ain't seen anything yet in India, right? We're literally in the first power play of a 50 over match, so to speak, or the first innings of the first test match of a 5-test series, right? And there is just so much ahead here. So that's actually the good news, right? So if anybody thinks that anything is decided and spoken for, think again, right? Should never have that attitude. And even frankly, in the West, in Silicon Valley, people don't have that attitude, right? They're reopening things that everybody thought was done and dusted, right? So that will continue to remain, right? As technology, so clearly technology is going to be the magic formula to, and probably the only hope for a country like India or other emerging countries to even catch up with the customers' aspirations and the demands and the needs of the industry, right? And I'll start with um, a healthcare example, right? So, did you know that India has a grand total of somewhere between 4 and 6,000 cardiologists, right? To achieve the density of what the US has got as cardiologists, we need 90,000, right? So it's like a monstrous gap, 15x. Now, India only adds 250 new cardiologists a year, right? And this is assuming all of them continue to work as cardiologists in India, right? It's like a massive assumption we're making, right? Not to mention that several might be retiring or what have
Right.
you. So, the net is not even 250, right? So if you do the math, we're never going to catch up at all, right? That is also not, that is assuming that the United States is itself at the right density, right? With themselves at a shortage, right? Um, so how is this ever going to be closed, right? The only way quality healthcare, and you can replace healthcare with education, with what have you, right? Whatever topic, financial services, etc. That gap can only be bridged. Thankfully, we have something exponential that's happening here in the form of technology, right? Whether it's like, and hopefully through AI, which is becoming a really powerful tool, we're reaching that inflection point where the way in which the rest of the world had to, or the developed countries, so to speak, had evolved, does not have to be how India is going to evolve, right? And so with digital sort of being the answer to the foundation of the answers to everything we're going to do, that's going to create a massive new opportunity, right?
For sure.
So if you think about the West probably had better economic as well as service maturity before the internet came. China kind of, both the development, economic development, and the access to the internet happened around the same time. In India, it's almost the other way around, right? Where the internet penetration has happened, and it will end up being the mechanism through which we achieve the improvement in people's lives, the economic prosperity, the improvement of education, etc. Right? So in India, more than anywhere else, and of course, the rest of the developing world, in many of the countries are on par or perhaps slightly behind India. Um, you know, I think a lot of what is happening in India will be the formula for the remaining 5 to 7 billion people on the planet, right? So as a result, what we are seeing, for the first time also is even the companies like the Googles of the world that built solutions for the first world economies and said, we would just bring it and eventually India and all the other countries will come on board, have realized that they need to also redefine and think about maybe the solutions for a country like India are how they need to approach the rest of the world, right? And in some cases, the solutions from India, like the Google Pay, for example, if you look at what they launched in Silicon Valley now, right? It was A, driven by the team that launched Google Pay in India, and B, a lot of the things that they brought into India, of course, they don't have the beauty of the UPI rails that we have, right? Will actually be re-exported back to the US as well, right? So we're seeing a lot of that happening.
Right.
The one thing that India has, and I feel very fortunate to have played a very small role in the early days, and it has really evolved into a massive thing, is the digital rails that, frankly, has been done by a combination of public-private partnership and a lot of the government support for it, right? That with the combine it with the think tank, whether it's through iSpirit and other mechanisms, has really set the foundation for a country like India to almost take advantage of the fact that we were a late mover here, right? So because the US was sort of discovering everything and everything was done sort of in the Wild West model and, the first time, and we learned all the mistakes, right? And then they kept course correcting there. China sort of had a very, different set of criteria and parameters that drove their development, but in a very sort of use of the internet, but in a proprietary way, which probably does not apply to the rest of the world. And India kind of, by starting around 2010, we learned all the things that were going on there, and we saw what the benefits were, and we saw what the downsides of the implementations were. And by that time, I think the internet technologies and software technologies and mobile smartphone becoming the platform, the default platform. I think these things allowed us to say, what's the right way to do this? Sort of with openness, interoperability, API-driven, microservices-based architectures, embedded fintech or embedded health tech, all these things, right, becoming sort of the right ways to do it. And the other thing that happened was India, through the, as you said, through the 90s to then, also had the benefit of the services companies, whether it's the TCS or the Wipros or the Infosys or the Cognizants or the Persistence or what have you, having created the technology expertise in the country here, right? And just the understanding that that's where so it's sort of been a perfect storm for India, where you have the third generation of the maturity of the rails. You have the smartphone and the commoditization of the connectivity, and thanks to networks that are now at the lowest cost of data, and you had the expertise, and lastly the aspiration, right, of the common man. So the Indian middle class is probably one of the most aspirational ones, wanting to go up. So all these things have come together at kind of the right time, and it's going to mean opportunity for the incumbents. It's going to mean opportunity for the service providers. It's going to mean opportunity for the entrepreneurs, right? And that's very, very unique situation to be in, not just for Indian companies, but for global players also wanting to come into India, right? The last thing is COVID, obviously has been challenging and tragic for several, and it's very unfortunate. But on the flip side, it has also sort of flattened the world, right? So Indian companies now, are brave enough to say we can go global and we can target those markets. Global companies are also going to come into India and say, hey, it doesn't matter what the geographic boundaries are. People need these products and solutions. So it's a very dynamic environment. And that's where, of course, once there's a dynamic environment like this, you create a perfect storm and an opportunity for anybody to break out, right? And that's the opportunity space here right now.
Wow, that is a very, very elaborate and very clear answer to, what may seem like the opportunities that exist, and goes to show that, the scope of opportunity is immense. If anybody, as you mentioned at the start, thinks that we've reached the nexus, we've reached the epitome, they're wrong, and they should think again, and there's so much to be grabbed yet. So thank you so much for that. And the array of experiences are great. We'd probably, revisit this again, because I'd love to take a deep dive into your Aadhar story and, as they call you, the fintech guru, as I heard. We'd love to know more about it later during the episode. But I want to quickly jump to, Prime and the way you called it a startup, because that's one of the thing that, I found out during my research as well, that it's different from other VC funds. There's a set ideology, and I love the way it's functioning. So if you could probably give our audience a bit of context as to the differentiating factors at Prime, the way you're not going for the fund size, you're not going for a large number of companies, you're very particular about which companies to invest in, you're very particular about not treating it just as a first check, you're particular about making sure that you're helping the founders through the cycle of the company, and how there's the composition between the partners that stands out as well. So if you could probably give us an insight as to how Prime is functioning, what are the differentiating factors, it'd be great for us to understand from the viewpoint of an entrepreneur, as well as from the viewpoint of a fund and a fund manager, if you may.
All right. So Jivraj, thanks for the lucid description of what we strive to be. I think it's still sort of work in progress, and learning and adapting as the ecosystem does evolve. But our fundamental philosophy is, good startups are few and far between, and great entrepreneurs as well are rare, and money is a commodity in some ways, right? So for founders, who are seeking out and who end up working with us, we hope that they're looking, and we look for founders where ideally anybody would have funded them, but there is a relationship between us and and the founders, and how we think we can work together. Raising funding especially at the seed stage, is probably the most important decision founders will make, as to who is the partner and why are they choosing the partner. And I want to make sure that the founders that choose to work with us choose to, despite everything, despite the money, right? They're choosing to work with us because it's a long-term relationship, and the value that they feel they're going to get beyond the capital is extremely valuable to them, right? And I think it's less understood by people, and it's probably less emphasis is placed on that by founders initially, and that's the maturing of the ecosystem, right? When we started out, it was it's a lot less mature, and now it certainly has evolved over the years. One of the things I'm finding is actually, I thought that the close working relationship that we would have with the founders would really be of more value to first time founders. We have found of late, a lot of the companies we have funded are actually second time founders, or some cases multiple times, because they actually value the interactions a lot more because they've seen it once and not had it the first time. So it actually in some ways has actually was a pleasant surprise to us as well, right? But having said that, see, being a founder is probably one of the most difficult and lonely jobs one can have. And many times you cannot even confide in your co-founder, and certainly in most cases you can't confide in anyone other than that, right? And we want to be very close to the entrepreneurs during those moments. We want to be the first phone call that they make. We want to be happy to brainstorm with them at all times, right? What that means, however, is that you can't have a very large portfolio, right? Because you want to spend the time with the founders, right? We took it a step further and said, not only will it be, that we are going to spend a lot of time as a partnership, all the three partners have a lot of operating experience, and we have very complementary operating experience, right? So Amit Somani is probably one of the best at product thinking, right? He's one of the best at scaling, right? Because he has seen Make My Trip go through the IPO process, right? Shripati is an amazing, metrics guy, amazing operations guy. And, I actually like to think very out of the box with all the startups and push them to think very differently from what they're thinking, right? Now, the combination of this background is actually important for all startups, right? So unlike other VC funds, we felt what would work better for us is actually if all of us put uh, our, our mind share for every one of the companies, because they all need each of these at different times. So even if I might be the lead partner on HapPay, Shripati or Amit or Bala or whoever might actually spend a lot of time with the founders on specific areas, and they're available anytime the founder calls, right? So the downside of that is that we can't have, 10 companies a year. We can only do, 3 to 5 companies a year, right? So, there is no right or wrong in this industry, right? But there is different, right? And this is who we are, right? So what we also need to do is match founders to a similar thought process, right? So we don't want to get to a founder who says, look, just give me the check, I'll run my business 100% by myself, right? It's actually founders who actually enjoy having an open relationship and conversation with us. And I've had many times where our founders have talked to some of their friends and they say, oh, I can't believe you had this conversation with your investor, right? And that's not the relationship we have. We are building this together. I jokingly tell people, this is a more important relationship than marriage, because it's very hard to get out of this one. Right? Jokes aside, it is actually a very long term relationship, and it has to be one that you're going to enjoy, right? Both for the founders and for us, right? So we like to have a lot of fun with our founders. We like to understand them, their motivations. The motivations are very important to understand, right? So this is one aspect of Prime where all partners have a lot of operating experience, and we like to work closely with the founders. A few things have changed over the years as well, right? So the first part has not changed at all, but a few things have changed over the years, right? And in terms of how early we do come in, right? Yes, we do still write the romantic check to somebody who just had an idea, and we brainstormed and we loved this thing and we went ahead. But more and more what we are seeing is that actually what's happening now in India is because of cloud and mobile and all of the maturity in the tech, even for founders, it's a lot easier to do some amount of PMF, product market fit validation, even for they speak to even someone as early as us, right? So more and more we are seeing that companies, they may not have a lot of revenue traction or anything like that necessarily, but there is a fair amount of validation that has already happened, right? And I think that's a very good sign, right? Because uh, we keep talking about risk taking, risk taking, risk taking. If you're not willing to, as a founder, I mean, I think we are past the stage where founders in this industry don't have an ability to take any risk, right? So it's a question of, do you have the courage to take the risk, right? I mean, if you worked in the software tech industry for 2 years, I think you've saved up enough to launch a product and test it.
Right.
That's the least of the issues, right? Um, so if you can't even go 3 to 6 months to follow your conviction, then what are we talking about here, right? Why is it that till somebody external writes a check, you're not convinced, right? So founders to us should be people who are convinced about the problem they are trying to solve and how they're going to go solve it and why it's important enough. And that's an important sign before you actually turn to an investor, right? I mean, if you don't have the conviction, how do you expect somebody else to have the conviction?
Right.
So I think we are seeing more of that. So more of the companies that we are funding are already with the product, and it's in rare cases, of course, we will still back outstanding founders, but there is a fair amount of validation that's already happened.
Mm.
Um, Third thing is, I think people are coming out of first generation unicorns or startups, right? And then doing startups. So what's really nice now is that people have seen scale. They may not have had the personal ownership and the financial success or what have you necessarily, but they understand a lot more, right? Earlier, you would find very half-baked products that you take to market, but nowadays the level of professionalism and maturity we are seeing with the founders and their nuanced understanding of the market, right, is becoming very interesting. And fourthly, the markets themselves are becoming very deep, right? So earlier you had to get $30 million of revenue, you probably had to do 4 or 5 things, right? And it would take 5 to 7 years to get there, right? Now we are seeing companies doing it in as early as 2 years, but certainly in 3 to 4 years, right? Getting to that scale, doing one thing, right, and serving one customer segment. That is probably the most exciting evolution that's happened here in India, right? Um, because the moment you have depth of market, because startups actually don't win by doing too many things. Startups win because they just had to do one thing, but they did it so well, right? And they're just so perfectly focused on that segment and that problem that they can do a better job than any big company can do, right? And then that's when you start building. And over a period of time, of course, you expand out, right? But what used to happen in India is because you didn't have a lot of revenue velocity and because you didn't have depth in the market, you had to do 5, 6 things and cobble it together. And you become almost like a services company rather than a product company.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Um, One last thing I will say also related to this is I label this the circa problem, right? What ends up happening is as a startup, when you start at a given point in time, you look at all the considerations around you, you do a lot of research around the market and you understand what the problem is and you come up with a strategy and a solution and you build out and then you're looking at all your peers and they're growing at a certain pace and you say, I'm keeping track or I'm growing better than them. But the rate at which this market is changing, companies that might have started 2 years later might grow much faster than you, right? And you, if you don't pay attention to that, you will be dealing with the circa problem, right? You're thinking you're doing very well, you're solving the problem that you as you understood it, but the customer has changed, right? And that's happening incredibly fast now, right? Customers change, the opportunity has changed, and you might find yourself just not being. And so we have, even in our portfolio, we see some of our earlier companies wondering how come these new companies are growing so much faster than us, right? And the job of a founder is to keep reinventing yourself, right? You just cannot sit on your laurels, right?
Right.
So these are some of the things that we are seeing in the market over the years. And there are a lot of specific examples, obviously, where I can get into some of them. But I think for founders, what we are understanding now is knowledge of the market and the problem and the customers is far more mature. And as a result, the solutions that they're coming up with are far more mature.
Right. Right.
A few things that have not changed properly in India, right? I still feel founders have to get some more maturity and understanding in terms of keeping the companies clean, right? we still have this mindset of a proprietorship, just in the and a lot of crazy mistakes are made early on, right?
Right.
Which we, as the first institutional investor in almost all the companies, we unfortunately end up having to bear the brunt of this, right? Because we want to make sure that we clean up a lot so that the companies are well set up for the future. And it's really unfortunate that we still haven't found sort of a clean way in terms of how the companies are incorporated, how the books are set up, how the ownership is set up, all the regulatory filings and stuff. And India can be quite intimidating for startups. And I really wish founders spent a lot more time in making sure that they didn't do something which they would regret later, right? We can deal with stuff which has not been done, but things that have been done wrong, are very hard to reverse. Right? So I think founders need to really find some reliable sources, and a lot of attempts are being made in the ecosystem, but that actually can certainly help clean up um, the processes and stuff a lot more.
For sure.
Anyway, but overall, tremendous progress in this ecosystem.
Got it, got it. Great to see, the difference and the thought process that you're bringing on the table, because again, it's not a matter of size for you, it's about depth. And I love that entire concept because I think that's evident throughout your career as well. And it's something that you replicate with your portfolio companies as well. And you very often see a portfolio with almost all successes. And I hope it continues to be that way. But the results show as well. And it's great to understand better about Prime.